Since there's a lot of people here that probably haven't been here before, my name's Tom Zinnan. I work for the UW Extension Cooperative Extension folks. I also work for UW-Madison Biotech Center right here. And we do Wednesday night at the lab every Wednesday night. 50 times a year. Thank you. And you're all so well trained. And tonight, oh, here you go. Let me get this one. I think I did that. What happened to the one I wrote down with you? There it is. Tonight we get a really cool thing. As I mentioned my weekly missive yesterday, I live over in Vilas, and I moved into Campbell Street in 1994, and it's a block and a half north of Bear Mound. And it is a pretty amazing thing to live that close to something that ancient and that revered. Gives you a place to go to walk to at night. And I'm delighted to be able to have talk tonight on mounds from all over Wisconsin, but especially this is a very high concentration of mounds here just in the Madison area. Amy Rosebrough is our speaker tonight. She's with the Wisconsin Historical Society. She was born in West Plains, Missouri in the Ozarks, went to West Plains High School. She went to Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri, and got a undergraduate degree in antiquities. And then she got a master's degree at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville in anthropology. Then she came here to UW-Madison to get her PhD in anthropology, and she's been at the Historical Society since 2000. And I met Amy out on Picnic Point on April 8th or so. There was a Sunday of science expeditions, and I came up to her, and because there was a couple of mounds out there, and her exploration station was set up there. And I think I said to you, how many of the effigy mounds actually are burial mounds? And I think you said, all of them. And I was floored, because I was one of these guys that was taught, oh, most of the effigy mounds don't actually have burials in them. And Amy did a great job of explaining to me how that came. I think she'll probably mention that to us tonight. This is one of the remarkable things about Wisconsin and about the Madison area. I'm looking forward to this as Amy talks with us about the archaeology of Wisconsin's Effigy Mounds. Please join me in welcoming Amy Rosebrough to
Okay, welcome. Mic's on, I hope. Never can quite tell.
Well, we
So,
can confirm that. Can you tap the mic? Yeah, it's good.
yes, all right.
The audio people love that.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to come and speak to you about a very Wisconsin topic at a very Wisconsin university, and a university with deep connections to effigy mounds as well. This campus has effigy mounds on it. There are effigy mounds in the UW Arboretum, on Observatory Hill, out towards the natatorium. There are no effigies, but other types of mounds out on Picnic Point. And there are more mounds here than any other campus in the world. So it's a unique and wonderful place. And I have heard tales of visitors coming from overseas and specifically asking, I want to see the effigy mounds. You know, forget about all this groundbreaking genetics research and all this other stuff. You've got effigy mounds. You know, we can have DNAs everywhere. So thank you again for coming. This is just a great honor. If you're expecting a talk about, you know, dodging snakes and giant boulders and snapping bullwhips in the jungle, you're not going to get that. I like field work. I've done field work. I've had my share of adventures in close calls and near lightning strikes and tornadoes. That's great. But the dissertation that I finished here on effigy mounds was archaeology of archives. It was an answer to how do you study something that doesn't exist anymore. Most of the effigy mounds are gone, but not forgotten. In the university archives, at the Wisconsin Historical Society, in our archives, in long-forgotten journals, in diaries and maps, you can find the hints of the landscape that used to be here, and you can reconstruct that landscape based on the remembrances that people have of these wonderful creations, because effigy mounds are interesting. People didn't just walk past them and forget them. They went, there's a giant bird. I'm going to draw a picture of that. So I was able to use some of that. Any park in southern Wisconsin, take a look around. Look for these little boulders. Chances are you're going to find an effigy mound nearby. There were thousands of them at one point. Beautiful creations. And you don't need to go to Europe to spend money to get into museums to see fantastic sculptures. You can find them right here for free. They're great things, and they're really underappreciated, I think. The front page of the paper helped. They've been underappreciated for a long time. People have quarried them away, they've put roads through them, they've hauled them away for garden soil, they've slapped houses on top of them. What was here is mostly gone, and what is still here is in large part damaged. Finding a perfectly pristine, intact effigy mound is a rare thing nowadays. Highway Department, by the way, DOT, has since moved this road. So. Effigy mounds are a type of monumental artwork, and you do find similar artworks across the globe, but for the most part, they're dug into the ground. They're geoglyphs, or giant petroglyphs, in other words. They have removed the sod to expose chalk or light-colored soil underneath, like the giants and the white horses of Britain, or they're removing desert pavement to expose a lighter soil, like the famous Nazca lines and figures, or the geoglyphs of the Mojave Desert. Okay. But they're dug in. In a few places, Minnesota, Manitoba, there are what are called petroforms, and these are artworks created by outlining rocks. They're usually much, much smaller, but at least they're going up a little bit. And then you have the mounds. So our mounds. Wisconsin has more mounds and had more mounds than any other state in the US, and we are the only place where effigy mounds were routinely built. And in fact, if you go outside of Wisconsin's borders, after you get about a county into Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota, you're out of the effigy mound region. It's a very Wisconsin phenomenon. The only place where people routinely raised up earth to make bas-relief sculptures of people and spirits and animals. Thousands of them. So here's Man Mound. He's my guy. He's our ambassador, declared a National Historic Landmark in 2016. Go see him. This is after the Burning Man event. Much calmer. Some of you got that. Just outside Baraboo. So up 12, turn on 33, out 33, stop at the Log Cabin Restaurant, eat s'mores pancakes, turn north on T, 1 mile east on Man Mound Road. When you see the white lines, you've just driven over his legs. But he is the only man mound on Earth, the last survivor. So it's worth going to see him. The effigy mounds were part of a larger mound building phenomenon in Wisconsin. Most date to the period between 8700 and around 1200 or so. Mostly in southern Wisconsin, they correspond almost exactly to the extent of oak savanna. If you go north, you're into boreal forest, west and south on the plains, and east we got that big lake in the way, so you're not building mounds there. Up in northwestern Wisconsin, they were making simple geometric forms, but making them very, very big. Northeastern Wisconsin, simple mounds, but small. And here in southern Wisconsin, the people just went wild. This huge proliferation of mound forms, animals in geometric shapes, crosses and scissory-looking things and chains. And it's amazing. They understood that you could do a lot of things with dirt, and they did. But again, most of them are gone. So the first obstacle I encountered in my own research was, okay, where am I going to find the mounds now? And okay, they're on paper. Second obstacle was not every map maker approached mounds the same way. Everybody had their own little quirks and personalities and eccentricities. And at first, people didn't even realize what they were seeing. So the oldest account of mounds I've been able to find, Major Stephen Long, he was here to find a place for a fort. He traveled down towards Prairie du Chien, and his diaries and journals record what are clearly effigy mounds, but he's a military guy, so he's thinking in terms of fortifications. they just didn't make any sense to him. Like, these are terrible. You know, there's gaps and the traverse, and they don't connect to each other. But if you map out what he's talking about, okay, that's a bear, that's probably a bird, he just wasn't in the right frame of mind. The oldest map I've been able to find dates directly to the first survey of Wisconsin, 1834. The surveyor ran right across a couple of effigy mounds and was kind enough to sketch them out. So we've got, it's probably a water spirit down to the lower left and either a bear or a mink that the section line crossed over on the upper right. So yay, surveyors. By the 1840s, people were really beginning to take note of what they were seeing. Now, fortunately, the main path from the Blue Mounds to the Lead region happened to run along an ancient trail that was flanked by effigy mounds about every half mile between Madison and the Blue Mounds. So as people were heading into the Lead region, they couldn't quite help but notice they were surrounded by giant animals and began to write accounts of them that were being sent back to Congress, for example, and published in obscure journals here and there. The first person to specifically say, yep, that's an animal, is our own Increase Lapham, Wisconsin's premier early naturalist and scientist. He published an account in the 1830s in a local Milwaukee newspaper describing one of the mounds as a turtle, we would call it a water spirit today, very long-tailed, and then mentioned destruction of the mound right next to it. So this is also, coincidentally, the very first call for mound protection and preservation. And Wisconsin's legislature heeded his call in 1986, so right onto that. At the time he wrote, there was a controversy brewing about who had built the mounds. Lapham said, I think it's the modern native nations of Wisconsin. There's no reason they couldn't have. Okay. It's not like we doubt that modern Egyptians' ancestors built the pyramids, so why shouldn't the ancestors of today's native nations, why shouldn't they have built mounds? Okay. But there was a whole other school of thought that said, oh, no, that can't be, it's too civilized. And they were coming up with this lost race. Either it was people from the Aztecs from Mesoamerica, or maybe there were Vikings, or Phoenicians, Romans, somebody, but not the Native Americans that lived here. And that idea caught favor, because if there had been a civilization that the native nations then had wiped out, then it was only fair that the bearers of white civilization should come back in and reclaim it. So we'd scoot those pesky Native Americans right off the land and we'll take it back for civilization. The Smithsonian jumped into the mix first, said, okay, we're going to solve this problem. We'll send field workers out to Wisconsin. They dug into a couple of mounds, didn't find anything, said effigies are worthless, and never opened another one again, which is great for us. That means they didn't go rooting around everywhere. Headed south, where mounds often contained burial offerings that they could link then to known groups. But effigy mounds didn't completely fall out of the scientific mindset. So this is Stephen Peet. He was a preacher and antiquarian who lived in Beloit. Was the first person after Lapham to really take a good look at the mounds. I had heard his name going into the research phase, and it was always, oh yeah, Pete. Whew, what a nut. And he did have some quirks. He saw the emotional attitude of the effigies. He could read the code. He could tell what they were trying to say by looking at their positioning. And he published article after article after article in the American Antiquarian and Oriental Journal, which he helped edit, all about the mounds. And he accepted any map anybody ever sent him, regardless of whether the map was accurate or the mounds even existed or not. So everyone had just completely blown him off, but one little insight that he'd had kind of slipped through the cracks. So I'm going to give him his due. He was the first person to notice that if you look at the animals represented, they're not the same everywhere. He came up with what he called his clan centers, that there were different social groups that claimed particular territories, that you could say, this is the territory of the squirrel people. This is the territory of the wolf people or the wolf clan. And everyone ignored this for decades because Pete, His contemporaries really didn't think anything of him either. Here's his arch rival. This is Theodore Hayes Lewis. He was a cranky individual. Had right to be, sadly. He was a school teacher turned surveyor. He loved mounds, and he was very good at what he did. He measured every mound 3 times because he was absolutely terrified that somebody would find a mistake and show him up. You know, he was the kind of guy, he was better than everybody, he didn't like anybody. You know, every letter contains, oh yeah, that guy, and then an insult or two. He was hired by a businessman named Alfred Hill in Minnesota to conduct what was the largest privately funded archaeological survey in U.S. history, the Northwestern Archaeological Survey and the Southeastern Archaeological Survey. And he would jump between the two with the seasons. When it got too cold to do anything up here, he'd head south. All he did was find mounds and map mounds and send his journals back to Mr. Hill. He was just meticulous. When you find his maps and survey notes, you know you don't have to resurvey a site. They're just lovely. And he didn't map every group, though. Some he just wrote down. He liked his mounds to be in very good condition before he started a survey, and if a mound site was in the process of being destroyed or damaged, he usually would just jot a little note about it in his notebook and move on. But even those are valuable. The Harpers Ferry Great Group, this is the largest effigy mound site ever recorded. He mapped 4 mounds and walked away. This is a reconstruction, very hypothetical, based on his survey measurements and on what we know about other mound sites in the vicinity, how they're arranged, how tightly they're grouped. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mounds at this site, and not a single one survives today. This is the only record. Nobody else came along later and mapped it. They were gone in short order. Lewis, as I said, had a right to be cranky. While he was serving in Minnesota, he received word that his employer, Mr. Hill, had passed away unexpectedly due to pneumonia. And when he returned to the house to claim his notebooks as data, he found that Mr. Hill had not told anyone that he was funding the survey. He was afraid how his fellow businessmen would treat him if they knew he was doing something so frivolous with his money. So when he showed up to claim the said journals, the family and Mr. Hill's friends turned him away. He was deemed a scalawag, a liar, a common thief, and he never got access to his material. He had published a small number of articles in Science and other magazines of the day, and that's all that ever saw print. It took many, many years. I was just determined to trace him down, and with the help of Fred Finney, another archaeologist from UW, we eventually did find him, and the sad end is that he died a pauper in a poor house in St. Louis in the 1930s. He never saw his life's work publicized and published. So I'll give him his due too. After the Smithsonian decided that, yep, mounds were indeed built by Native Americans, and Pete kind of faded into obscurity, and Lewis went on his very sad way, mound research in Wisconsin was taken over by the Wisconsin Historical Society. Charles E. Browne, yep, Charlie Brown. That's him, the kind of the dour-looking fellow with the arrow pointing at his head, sitting on the rocks at Devil's Lake. He came in and was the first person to take a look not only at the mounds but at village sites as well. He advertised in local newspapers. Said, do you know about a mound site? Do you know about a village site? Have you found artifacts? Tell me about it. And he collated all of this information from all over Wisconsin, publishing article after article after article in a journal called The Wisconsin Archaeologist, still in publication, the longest running archaeological journal in the U.S. He tallied up where sites were. He went out and visited them himself. He mapped mound sites. He kept meticulous records. Couldn't find north to save his own life. So his maps you have to do this a lot with on the ground. Eventually you get it. But a good guy, and some of the clearest handwriting I encountered during the entire research phase, which is really important. And then, Charlie worked until the 1940s. At the time he was closing out his career, professional archaeology was coming on the scene. Milwaukee Public Museum started it with an excavation sampling strategy where they opened up effigy mound sites in an east-west direction across the state. So they were the first really to say, okay, this is how mounds are built, this is what we're finding inside them. And what they were finding inside them was confusing them, because A, it wasn't much, and B, what they were finding wasn't uniform. They were finding projectile points of every style you could imagine, the pottery, every kind of decoration you could imagine, and they were just flummoxed by it. W.C. McKern of the museum pioneered a strategy called the Midwestern taxonomic method, where you could recognize an archaeological culture by the items left behind. The idea was that culture A would make their pots and spear points and tools one way, and culture B would make them a different way. So if you looked at the artifacts, you could say that's culture A, that's culture B. They're archaeological cultures. And he wasn't really coming up with a discrete set of traits for the effigy builders, and it drove him kind of nuts. He went ahead and published a list and said, okay, this is what we think. It was mostly wrong, but he tried. And there was a reason, which I'll get to in just a little bit, why he was so confused. I feel a little more sympathetic towards him now than I did when I was doing the initial research. It was University of Wisconsin-Madison scientists that kind of found the initial Rosetta Stone. Dave Barris, Warren Witry, and colleagues helped with a salvage excavation in the 1950s of the Coulterman Mound Group in Dodge County. And salvage excavation at that time basically meant let's dig a hole really quick before the bulldozer knocks this mound over, and then we'll follow the bulldozer as it knocks that mound over and see what's left behind. And they found, in the one they were able to excavate very well, a nice and very, very rare cache of artifacts. So let's see if I can get this to work. All right, that pot. That knife. And one more. That arrow point. So one pot decorated with the impression of woven cordage and a little triangular arrow point. Okay, and those two items had been found together by UW scientists just down the road on University Avenue near Shorewood School. There's a site called the Black Hawk Village site. It's the type site for Effigy Mound Villages. They were the first people to say, hey, we're finding these two things in association here, and based on some other research that Robert Hall, another student, was doing, we think this should be the right place in the temporal sequence to connect up with the effigy mounds. Because effigy mound builders didn't normally put artifacts in their mounds on purpose. So connecting a mound to a village site was pretty hard. You had to know what artifacts matched up with what. So for the first time, they were able to say, okay, this is what we need to look for. We need to find pots with cord impressions on them, and we need to find little tiny triangular points. And because artifacts are named after their type site, that's Madison cord impressed and Madison triangular points. Very handy, very local. So by the 1970s and 80s, people then had built up a picture of what effigy builder life was like by looking at the village sites and campsites where those two objects were found in association. And so you get William Hurley's, oh, it's all this big homogeneous culture. They're all making the same things and doing the same things, and this is one population, and they share a common fate, and they're just all the same. Which doesn't really make sense. If you take another look at the trait list, every object listed either in McKern's original trait list or in the later trait list is either too broad, that it's found outside the area of effigy construction, or it's too small. It's only found in part of the area of effigy construction. The only physical item that exactly matches the area of effigy construction are effigy mounds. So, okay, so we've got one culture, but no one's doing the same thing. That didn't make sense. So, the dissertation became an exercise in how to knock the pins out from under stereotypes. In other words, are all the things that we assumed true or not? And this is a great thing for any researcher to do, to look at long-held assumptions and see, do they still hold up? William Hurley had a reason for coming up with his idea that the homogeneous culture. Increase Lapham had reasons for coming up with the hypotheses he had. They were based in what was known at the time. As time moves on, you start to think, no, wait a minute, that may not be true. This is about as good a photo of effigy mounds as you get on the ground, by the way. Someone said, show me pictures. They sink into the earth, I swear. They drop. So you get the camera, down they go. Okay, first off, as Tom mentioned, effigy mounds are burial sites. Okay. Now there's a long-held kind of urban Wisconsin legend that effigy mounds are only ceremonial, that they're just sculptures. And absolutely they're ceremony. 100% they're sculptures. They may have been meant to represent spirits or living beings, but they're also burial sites. They're monuments. If you get into an effigy mound, which I don't recommend, it's against the law. If you get in, you've got about an 87% chance of finding human remains. I checked all the good excavation reports, and the ones where they didn't just plug a little hole in there and leave, but where they said, okay, we're digging this whole mound. Okay. And out of those really detailed, well-reported, extensive excavations, 87% of the mounds yielded human bone. And that last 13% or so, I have a feeling that soil chemistry and age, that not all human remains are going to survive. Also, they practice cremation. You know, try and find that and identify that as human. It's very difficult after 1,000 or so years. Second, there is no single burial practice for this time period. People are buried in the flesh as full skeletons. They're buried in bundles of bones. Effigy mounds tend to have fewer people. They're a little bit more likely to be in the flesh. They're a little more likely to be well-nourished, a little less likely to have suffered a broken bone. Linear mounds are kind of in between. Conical mounds, the dome-shaped simple ones, oh, you might have a few people in there, or you might have 100+ bundles of bone in one mound. Okay. A little less likely to be well-nourished and a little more likely to have suffered a broken bone. So something's going on with status here. The stereotype of effigy builders says that they're egalitarian, simple hunter-gatherers who maybe grew a little corn, possibly. They didn't trade extensively with anyone else. It was just a very simple, equal lifestyle. Now, that didn't make any sense to me either. And archaeologists tend to focus on burial goods as an indicator of economic and social inequality, that if you're buried with gold in the kitchen sink, you must be a very rich, powerful person, and if you get nothing, you must be poor and therefore, beneath contempt. There's nothing in effigy mounds. Everyone said, okay, yeah, they're egalitarian, there's no social differences, no class differences, no economic differences. Everyone's on an equal footing. Well, that ignores the mounds. Simple hunter-gatherers living in egalitarian societies do not build these. This is to scale. This is the largest documented effigy mound, the Ghost Eagle of Richland County, quarter mile from wingtip to wingtip. And I wish I could tell you how high it was. The problem is it wasn't discovered until after it was destroyed. It showed up as a soil shadow in a USDA aerial photo from the 1930s. People are like, why is there a giant bird in that field? But there it is. So there it is to scale. The actual mound could have been even larger because it's just what we're seeing in the shadow. I did some extraordinarily rough back-of-the-envelope calculations, and this is for a group of 50 healthy adults working sunrise to sunset, 3 months of labor. Now, if you're a hunting and gathering group, that's an entire summer that you're not gathering food and preparing for the winter to contain the grave of maybe one person. I have the suspicion that person was important. So the village sites then. There's been a lot of archaeology since William Hurley's manuscript was put out. A lot of this done in advance of more bulldozers and road construction projects. But even those are showing some variability. So if you look in Wisconsin, we've divided effigy builders into 4 or 5 phases. Keys Eastman, that would be your stereotypical effigy builder. So the portrait of the rather simple hunter-gatherer sort of holds there. In southeastern Wisconsin, it turns out they were doing a lot more corn farming than anyone suspected and living a bit more sedentary lifestyle. Up in northwestern Wisconsin, they were sticking to the river valleys, but not being quite as sedentary. You know, the people in the Keys-Eastman area were making Madison cord and pressed, and that was about it. The folks in the Horicon-Kikoski area were making Madison ware with another kind of pottery with a collar around the lip. The folks up in northwestern Wisconsin were making Madison ware and another kind of pottery that's very similar to one found in Minnesota. It's all incised instead of cord impressed. They're talking to different people, they're doing different things, but they're all making effigy mounds. And if you look at pots found in mounds, like Coulterman, it turns out they're not all the same either. There are 4 of them, 4 whole pots, wow. Such data. Okay, so Coulterman is the pot on the lower left. The pot on the upper left is, I believe, another Coulterman pot, also Madison cord and press. Upper right, that's a collar jar. That's from the Nitschke Mound group in Dodge County. That shouldn't be Effigy Mound, according to many of the theories. And the pot in the lower right, wow, that's so out of place. That was found in the 50s. An article was published that said, hey, I found this weird pot in an effigy mound at a weird site, and then everyone promptly went, that doesn't fit any theory we have, and ignored it. And the pot itself got lost. I thought, I'll never see this thing. It's supposedly a Mississippian pot in a woodland mound, and it turned up, fortunately, just as I was beginning to write, on the top shelf of a museum display area in the Logan Museum in Beloit. Dust. Always dust your stuff. So I got to go check it out in person. The style of that pot is a style that originated in St. Louis, in that area. It has no business being in an effigy mound. Oh. All right, so if you can't recognize an effigy mound village site based on these 2 artifacts, how do you recognize it? It's hard. Map the mounds out. You find they're not distributed evenly. They're in great many clusters. And I'll bet that every single one of those clusters represents an independent band or village. There's not one great society or tribe. These are many independent villages, each doing their own thing, but sharing a particular ritual, and that is effigy construction. The static culture or stereotype model would indicate that if you map out all the different kinds of mounds, they should be more or less evenly distributed. The pottery design associated with them should be more or less evenly distributed. That's not what you find. If you look at the way pots are decorated, the things that are very hard to see because they're on the inside of the pot, or it's something you'd never even notice, like how the cord is twisted and knotted. These are things that potters do because that's how they learn to make a pot. Their mother or grandmother or aunt or friend said, you do it this way, and then they never really gave it another moment's thought. When you map those out, they're kind of even, not entirely. And that seems to indicate that this idea is being unconsciously carried all over Wisconsin. So the little low visibility things are saying people are moving around a lot. That matches the original theory. High visibility, we're saying this is me, this is who I am, this is who my group is. That's extraordinarily variable. But it's not geographically localized. There are some patterns. If you go towards the Mississippi, people tended to use horizontal motifs a lot more on the pottery. If you head towards Lake Michigan, they're going diagonal. But the motifs and the decorations themselves are highly specific to the site or the potter. Wildly variable. The mounds are variable as well. Again, there's some broad patterns. The closer you go towards Lake Michigan, the more water spirits you're going to find. Head towards the Mississippi, it's mostly bears and birds. Each community might have mounds of every type. Madison has all of them. We've got everything, we're at the middle. But in each community, no matter how many types are present, 1 or 2 dominate. There are far more bear mounds and bird mounds in the Prairie du Chien area than anything else. Head towards Milwaukee, 74% are water spirits, with a handful of other mounds scattered in. They're talking to each other in lesser degrees. in some areas, greater degrees in areas. This is a Brainerd-Robinson plot of how similar are the mounds between communities. So looking at the community just east of Lake Winnebago, they're pretty broadly similar to their neighbors, so they seem to be exchanging populations and ideas pretty regularly. Head to Prairie du Chien, they don't like their neighbors at all. No, you, but a little similarity with the people further away, so they're hopping.
What do the numbers represent?
Degrees of similarity. So the higher the number, the more that the sets of mounds are alike. Okay. I hate math. That's about the only math I did for the whole thing. So, there are artistic patches within this. So traditions. The people in the Wisconsin River, if they have jointed legs on an effigy mound, they like to make sure the joints face the same way. When you get into the Mississippi River Valley, both north and south, they point towards each other. We got knock-kneed animals. The animals represented probably, and this is something that was picked up on by the very first geologists who bumped into them in the 1840s, probably represent clans. So these are the clans of the Ho-Chunk, divided into animals of the upper world and animals of the lower world. And when you look at the most dominant mound forms in each locality, it usually is, if there are two of them, an upper world form and a lower world form. So it's a pretty close match to how the Ho-Chunk and the Iowa and some of the other native nations arranged their own societies. And this may be the birth of a clan system. And the reason you don't have just water panthers here and just goose mounds there probably has to do with how people are moving. The pottery says they are jumping between communities. They're not staying in the same village they're born in their whole lives. And that may be due to the resources. They were growing corn, yes, but they were also relying very heavily, among other things, on nuts for food to get them through the winter. And if you ever harvest nuts, you know that some years it's great and some years the trees just refuse. So if you're living, for example, in the Muscadet area, the Eagle Township cluster, and the nut harvest fails, you go to live with your relative. And if your village has people from multiple clans living in it, people can scatter different directions. It puts a lot less stress on any individual community that then has to absorb the overflow. So in reality, your catchment area turns from this into that. So it's a great way for people to mitigate resource shortages and problems, and in addition to mitigate political stress. It's called voting with your feet. Okay. Now, my original studies were on the northern Great Plains, and I was able to draw from some of that ethnography with the work here. And in particular, there was one account of a ritual leader whose name translates into Cherry Necklace. And he was said to be a very, very bad leader. And half or so of his village voted with their feet. They split off to found a new village some distance away. Now, one person can't say, I'm going to force you to come back. They don't have that kind of physical power. There's no institutionalized police force or army that's going to round everyone up and haul them back home. But as a leader, he's going to want to have a large population for defense and for resource procurement. Cherry Necklace's reaction was to go up into the hills and pray. And he stayed up there long enough that the people who'd stayed with him went up to see why. What are you doing? Oh, not much. I'm just praying that the buffalo never go to that village and they starve to death. And I'm doing the rituals that ensure that their enemies will come down and slaughter them. So the relatives of those folk living with him went running over to the next village. You know what he's doing? He's cursing you. You know, he's calling down the enemies. He's driving the buffalo away. Here's the thing. They believed he could do that. So village number 2 came right back. Okay. He didn't have to physically demand that they come back. He didn't have to pay them. This is a system called masked or hidden ranking. It's economic inequality or power inequality that's hidden because it doesn't manifest in really neat things in gold buried in burial mounds. It's all about knowledge. If you have knowledge that other people don't have, you're more powerful. So who's designing the mounds? The mound shapes themselves are very different from community to community. If you go to the Willow Drive mounds at the natatorium, there's a goose effigy there, and you'll notice the wings are shaped like this. They zigzag. That's a Madison goose. Go to the Horicon Marsh, there are goose mounds there too. Goose clan in both areas. But the wings don't zigzag. Different mound designers, different artistic styles. And I have a suspicion that the people who are designing the effigy mounds and conducting this ritual, they are the equivalent of Cherry Necklace. Maybe not incompetent, but they're the ritual leaders. They're the people in charge who have the knowledge about how you get the deceased to the afterlife. How do you build a mound? What does it all mean? They know this, other people don't. They're the ones being buried in the effigy mounds. That's why they're a little better nourished and a little less likely to have suffered a broken bone. So the general population may jump from village to village, camp to camp, as needed. But the ritual leaders are going to stay in place because this is their power base. They are literally tying themselves to the earth with the mounds they're creating, with the ancestors they're burying in there. So when Cahokians come up from St. Louis and introduce new religions and new technologies and start a little competition, I have a feeling that some of these villages went, we're all for that. And others went, keep us out of it. We're going to be traditionalists. And everyone has always assumed, well, Effigy Mound just goes away all at once. These other people, these Oneota, Mississippians, come in and take their place. I don't think that's what's happening. I think one village begins to adopt Cahokian lifeways, another village begins to adopt Cahokian lifeways. Those villages, for whatever reason, do better, maybe because they're growing more corn or a better variety, they're putting in more surplus, their population grows. People then begin to vote with their feet. And what we do see at this time period is an emptying out of the landscape as effigy mound settlements vanish and Oneota centers blossom. The people in the Madison area left. After AD 1200 or so, there's nobody here for centuries. They all went to Lake Koshkonong, to the Oneota villages there. Okay. So, technology. After I finished the dissertation, after pouring through maps, trying to find accurate map makers like T.H. Lewis that could help me out on this new technology was invented called LiDAR. Wonderful stuff. And around the same time as this is coming in, as part of my duties at the Wisconsin Historical Society, I was invited to help resurvey a mound site, a very large one in Grant County, that had been surveyed by Milwaukee Public Museum, but the maps had vanished during the Great Depression. There was a little bit of turmoil there. So the site needed to be redone. We found many, many more mounds out there than Will McKern had originally identified. Up to 120. They were packing effigy mounds into this site so tight they were bumping into each other. Like, we're going to put them here, darn it, even if there's not room. So they're banging them into each other in places. Okay. Something about that location was really drawing people in. So this is a real ritual center. And just as we finished this map, on the ground, crawling through buckthorn and, fighting windstorms and cows with coughs that snuck up on us and scared us to death, LiDAR comes in and is available. Amazing stuff. It's laser beams that shoot from planes that see through trees. No vegetation, no thorns, no brush. So here is an aerial view of Wyalusing State Park, trees. Here's the same spot in LiDAR. Yeah, it's great. So you see this great bear off the side and then a line of linear mounds snaking down the ridge. This is a typical Grant County procession of mounds. You can visit these, they're still there. On some of these images, you can even see if a mound has been looted or not. If you can see the pit. So I don't have to leave my desk now. This is lazy archaeology. So, a year or so ago, the legislature took another look at our burial sites protection law, and they were trying to figure out, should we strengthen it, should we weaken it, does it need to be changed? And one of the questions they asked is, how many mounds don't you know about? Okay, we got a LiDAR, excellent. So we took a couple of areas of Wisconsin, sat at the desk and just did a sampling strategy. We were just looking, pouring, scrolling through these LiDAR images, 1 square mile at a time. And around that site I showed you with the 120-something mounds, it was a jackpot. undiscovered mound group after unreported mound group, all hiding. It's almost a pristine landscape. So here's a bird, okay. More birds, linear mounds. You can see some faint conicals in there that are showing up. Okay. Another bird and linear, okay. Line of linears and conicals. Even this arrangement, I think this actually predates Effigy Mound, but there's a circle of mounds around a big mound with mounds going off geometrically to either side. I really want to visit this spot. So we're seeing through the trees. And what we discovered was there's a lot of mounds we don't know about. They're still out there. And I was terrified the entire time because I had written the dissertation, I turned it in, it had been deposited to the library. I had this, okay, here are all the numbers of mounds, and this is what mounds should be found in which area, and this is where you find them, and here are all these new mounds. Like, great, now it's out of date. Second of all, what if it doesn't match? Fortunately, testable hypotheses. So the right kinds of mounds showed up. Birds, short-tailed animals, a few bears. They're done in the right art style. They're naturalistic as opposed to the abstract style that you see in eastern Wisconsin. They should have had raised heads for the local art style. Heads, for the most part, nice and pointing at the sky. Okay. Knees pointed inwards towards each other, not so much. That one didn't hold up. The folks in the Grant River Valley liked straight legs more than they liked jointed, so whatever. Tails should have been at every single angle. Yeah, some are up, some are down, some are straight. And they should mostly be popping up on the ridge tops as opposed to the river bottoms, also confirmed. Okay. Now, if we were to repeat the study with other localities, my hope is that the same thing would happen. We'd be say, okay, now we're starting to understand the geography at least, if not the lifestyle. So more excavations need to take place at the village sites with a more open mind about what an Effigy Mound village site looks like. And then I think we can get at the idea of where did they go. They did their own thing. It wasn't a single unified culture. It was, in fact, a complex society of people who share many traits with modern Ho-Chunk. Ho-Chunk considered the Effigy Mound people to be their ancestors. I asked, they wouldn't explain. Tell me what's no. Okay, fine. So if you want to really know what's happening, I've given you the archaeological version. If you want to really know what's happening, talk to historic preservation at the Ho-Chunk Nation. They may or may not tell you anything. But you'll get probably a much more in-depth view than I could ever give you just looking at old maps and LiDAR images. So I hope that has kept you entertained for the night, and thank you for having me. We'll end with the one mound that really photographs well because it floods all the time. Questions? Yes?
Yeah, at the very end you mentioned the Ho-Chunk. I was wondering, are they still doing the research? They were very actively doing it maybe 20, 25 years ago. And they also possess ground radar, too.
They do have the ground penetrating radar units. They do visit sites from time to time. As far as research, that comes and goes. They are actively doing outreach. So Bill Quackenbush, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, has given tours lately. And the site, the Effigy Mounds in the Snow, the Gale Group, they've actually purchased that site and are now restoring it to original condition. So,
is Larry John still involved with this?
He shows up in our office from time to time. Yeah, in fact, he's in the paper. I saw his picture in the paper today. Yeah.
Out east of the big Woodland and Hopewell mounds, they're huge. No Effigy mounds. Why are the Effigy mounds here?
They had the idea here. They had the idea here, and for whatever reason, it caught on. The only Effigy mounds outside of Wisconsin, the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. There's what they call the Alligator Mound. It's probably another water spirit to the same culture in Ohio. There's a bird in Georgia, but they're extraordinarily rare. For whatever reason, people went, we don't want to do that. People here went, go for it, big time. Yeah.
Are there directions online or someplace on how to get to some of these mounds?
Keep an eye on our website. I am trying to get a guide to the mounds of Dane County posted. Otherwise, I recommend a couple of books. Spirits of Earth by Robert Birmingham, which is an overview of all the mounds in the Madison area, and he does give directions to the publicly accessible sites. And there's a book called Indian Mounds of Wisconsin. Bob's the primary author on that. There have been a couple of editions. And there's an appendice in the back of that book that lists mound groups you could visit all over Wisconsin. You could tour the whole state from mound group to mound group.
Yeah, can you give me the directions to get to that man mound again?
Okay.
Which was really fast, but I've heard you say this before, and I'm taking my grandchildren there, and I can't remember.
Okay.
Because you do Highway 33 and then
Okay.
go to the log cabin and get the, whatever, and I'm like, okay,
University Avenue to 12,
to 12.
in Middleton.
Okay.
12 north to Baraboo.
Okay,
33 through Baraboo
okay.
to the east side of town where the Log Cabin restaurant is. Stop at Log Cabin, have s'mores pancakes. Oh, they also consider pie to be a side. This is important. Turn left at the Log Cabin on Highway T. About a mile north, you'll hit Man Mound Road. Turn right on Man Mound. Drive until you see his legs across the road.
Left down, okay.
Or Google Man Mound County Park.
Google Man Mound County Park.
Man Mound County
Okay,
Park.
okay. Got it.
I was wondering, are you very familiar, there used to be a state park, Lizard Mounds, now it's been
County
devoted
park.
to being a county park. Is there anything of particular interest in that park?
Effigy Mounds, lots of them. No, it's a beautiful site. They are slowly restoring the vegetation and kind of taking the forest off of it right now, so the mounds are coming back out into the open. They've installed a new kind of gazebo interpretive panel, but it's just a lovely site. If you want to see a good example of a relatively intact, large eastern Wisconsin ceremonial center, that's the place to go. And they've got water spirits and geese and wonderful things. Yes?
I mean, what was the landscape like, to your knowledge? Was it grassland so people could see far, or was it lots of trees like this? Was it a mix?
A mix, a real patchwork, which may have been why this phenomenon flourished here. It would have been an incredibly productive environment. So the oak savanna was a mix of patches of prairie, the savanna itself, softwood forest, hardwood forest, and marsh. And you probably wouldn't have had to travel far in any direction before you hit another environment that had its own set of resources. So the folks, for example, in southeastern Wisconsin were setting up shop on the marshes, the Walmarts of the ancient world. In western Wisconsin, they were moving seasonally to take advantage of river sources in warm weather, and then they'd probably move up through the forests and then into the savannas in the fall and then back again. So any environment you could imagine was here in small patches.
I wonder if the viewscape was important to this or not.
In some cases, possibly. One of the things I'm asked about a lot is astronomical alignments, which requires a pretty good view of the horizon unobstructed. And my answer always is maybe. Some of the mounds do appear to point towards solstice, sunrise, sunset, or other significant markers, but they all don't. In fact, it's pretty rare to find one that does. And again, if you've got independent communities where every designer is kind of doing his or her own thing, and then the Kochians arrive in the middle of all this. The Kochians were definitely doing astronomy, and they had wood hinges, and they're aligning things and pointing. Someone may have said, hey, we're doing this. Oh, how do you do that? Well, you do it this way. Okay, I'll point my mound this way next time. How you pick that out from the noise is rough.
Why hasn't erosion just taken them away over the 1,000 years?
I suspect it's that nice, happy prairie sod. So that our nice savanna vegetation, at least in those areas, is really protecting them. So Man Mound is next to what was a one-room schoolhouse. The kids used him as third base and hid in his armpit for games of hide and seek, and he got run over by kids for just decades and flattened out a bit. Now that they're having Burning Man every so often, and they've restored the prairie vegetation on top of him, it's a low prairie grass mix, he's noticeably plumping back up again. So he's kind of reinflating and feeling his oats. So the soil itself and the vegetation on it is really protective. Mm-hmm.
You said in that large mound it is no more than some estimates might be 3 months with 50 people.
Mhm.
But some of these smaller groups, is there any clues that we have of, did they come season after season to build it? Was it bands and families and people that came? And are there any clues also from habitation sites?
The habitation sites are fairly small for the most part, which is why I settled on 50. That's a sort of universal size for a mobile band of humans. As for coming time and time again, the folks in northwestern Wisconsin, absolutely, that's how their mounds got to be so big. And you see soil development and other indications of time passing in between the layers. You do not see that in effigy mounds. They will often contain a core of some kind where the earth is different, but it's usually just a simple dome over the burial feature itself, and then the effigy sits on top of that like a mantle. And there's no indication of time passing for that second step. So they do appear to be one-shot constructions. Yep.
Along those lines, what kind of shovels, implements, baskets? I mean, it's hard to go out in my backyard to dig something, and I've got a nice steel shovel. Do you have any idea of copper?
No copper. Copper was worked here in Wisconsin, some of the oldest copper working in the world, in fact. But by the time the effigies were built, they were really restricting the use of copper to small beads and some sewing implements. And all the rest had fallen out of favor, so no shovels. We know they had stone hoes, because those have been found at gardening sites and in other village sites. They probably were using hoes and shovels made out of the shoulder blades of deer as well. Those just don't preserve as well. Later, the Oneota were getting access to bison shoulder blades, which are much larger and sturdier, and they were gardening with those. Effigy Mound people may or may not have had those. The only actual digging implement I'm aware of that was found in an Effigy Mound, someone lost it, appears to have been a simple digging stick. In other words, they were just using it to loosen the earth. The general thought is, because you don't find holes next to effigy mounds, is that they're peeling back the sod, taking dirt from a very thin layer that will heal quickly, loading it into baskets, taking it a short distance to the mound site and building up the mound from that. And they may even have been building some of these mounds out of the sod blocks themselves. In other words, just a little bit easier. We'll take this, set that there. But yeah, it's a lot of work.
So it's almost like an igloo then, if they're doing sod blocks.
If they're doing sod blocks, yeah, just build up, build up, build up. And how it's designed, Jay Toth, formerly with the Ho-Chunk Nation, right before he left, was coming with some very interesting ideas involving standard units of length in mound groups. So I suspect a simple arrangements of sticks and twine could be used to scale up a drawing to something very massive, because he was finding uniform distances between joints in some of the mounds.
Now, you just touched on what I was going to ask. The thing that fascinates me is the idea of, well, one of the things, of the perspective required to visualize the shape on the ground and to draw the shape on the ground, which people then can fill in. Because, you need to be looking down at it in order to really plot it out right. But you suggested something just then about scaling up.
Scaling up, so what we think is happening to begin with is they would go to a location, so the location's chosen. What the images aren't showing you, but you'll pick up as you visit sites, is they're often not on exactly flat ground. The ground is slightly tilted. Man mounds that way, so his head's a little higher than his feet. So you do get a bit of a perspective. They come in, they're cutting the sod off first, so they're creating an outline, kind of like a cookie cutter. In central Wisconsin, they would then actually dig the mound form down in. So like an intaglio, and then the mound itself would be raised up in that. So you really get a three-dimensional sculpture if you could pull the whole thing out of the ground and stand it upright. In other areas, they just do the cookie cutter trick. So they're removing the sod, and then people come in and use that to build up the earth and sculpt it. They're amazing things. I mean, they really are works of art. And to scale up from something to this is amazing, and even that's just the final form. So one effigy mound in Sheboygan, okay. There's every indication at that site that they cut the sod out, lined it with a nice white sand so that it really popped, and then filled it with something flammable and set it on fire. So not only do you have a bird, you've got a flaming bird, which is great theater if you're one of those mound designers and ritual leaders. Aha, poof, look what I can do. Yes?
Do you know if there's ever been any research as to maybe there's a connection between the mounds and the people that drew the petroglyphs and pictographs that you can find in southwest Wisconsin?
Probably some of the same people. There's a lot of petroglyphs. We know that some of them are right around the right time period because they show people with bows and arrows hunting, and bows and arrows come in just before the effigies emerge. The problem is petroglyph sites are really hard to date. So they could be Effigy Mound or they could be the Oneota people who came after Effigy Mound. But the Oneota people didn't hang around in the middle of the driftless area too much, so chances are. And they do seem to show some of the same kinds of animals. Lots of birds, thunderbirds, occasional water spirits, bears from time to time, deer, lots of deer. You don't find many deer effigy mounds, which is I've always wondered about. It's a major food source, but you don't see them in effigy form except for a little bit here and there.
Maybe they were sacred.
Maybe sacred, or maybe they were food. No, I'm not going to be buried in food. I want a bear, Yeah.
Can you tell if almost all of the mounds that you've seen have the same degree of gracefulness as the one on the photograph there?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I like them all, but some are, from an aesthetic point of view and a personal aesthetic point of view, some of them do seem to be made nicer than others. So you really do see the hand of the sculptor and the designer. So it's a man mound, for example, is not only the last surviving man mound in the world. If you look at the maps we have of the other man mounds before they went away, he's by far the most detailed and naturalistic. He's moving, he's walking, he's got anatomical detail and joint shown. The couple man mounds in Richland County kind of look like, all right, yeah, they're there, but they're a little blobby. The people in southeastern Wisconsin really liked abstract. So the water spirits, for example, kind of look like wrenches. You've got a body and a couple of legs and there's a tail, and that's about all the effort they're going to put into it. It doesn't mean that they're not works of art. It's just they're more Picasso, and the people in southwestern Wisconsin are more Wyeth. Yeah. All right, thank you so much.